about the loyalty of this group of Messianic Jews. And so as a result, there was increasing persecution. The book of Hebrews is written to specifically address this. Let me ask you to turn with me, as we'll keep this slide on the screen. Let's actually turn to the first chapter of the book of Hebrews. And I'm going to simply read the portion to you. I'll be reading out of, excuse me if this is not your preferred translation, but I'll be reading out of something called the New American Standard. Sorry for the word American, but it simply happens to be a good translation. And there are some other fine translations out there as well. The Christian Standard Bible is a fine translation. The brand new Legacy Standard Bible looks to be an excellent translation. And so here's the first couple of verses of Hebrews. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers, and the fathers there would be the Hebrew word avot, literally the patriarchs, the Jewish patriarchs. So God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days he has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he has also made the world. And then it goes on to talk about the deity of Messiah. And so reading this, you'd say, why is this book named the Epistle to the Hebrews? Well, a couple of things. Number one, in the very first sentence, it says God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets. The prophets that he has in view are the prophets of the Old Testament, the Jewish prophets that you read about in your Hebrew scriptures. Those prophets were exclusive to the Jewish people. In other words, this was not particularly addressed to individuals who had coming out of pagan backgrounds. They did not have the benefit of having the Old Testament scriptures. They were coming to this all brand new. So as a result, this is one reason why all the early church fathers agreed that the title of this book is the Epistle to the Hebrews. It is literally written to literal ethnic Jews who had embraced faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And as the PowerPoint shows, the occasion for writing was that these Jewish people who had come to saving faith in Messiah Jesus were facing increasing persecution from two sides, from both Roman authorities primarily, and occasionally, and this is brand new for them, occasionally even from their own compatriots, from the Jewish community who was increasingly concerned about them. And so there was increasing talk of rebellion amongst the Jewish leadership. There were groups of zealots who would carry out guerrilla raids against Roman soldiers. There was increasing talk of revolt. And so the Roman authorities were clamping down. There was persecution that was increasing. Notice the year here is around 65 AD. A lot of these folks were now second generation believers. They had come to faith upon hearing the gospel from those who had first heard it from the lips of Messiah Jesus. In other words, these were not old-time believers who were living in 30 AD who had heard this, but perhaps they were children in 30 AD, but they had come to faith later on. And so there are a couple of actual turns of grammar there where the writer of the book of Hebrews actually addresses them as people who have heard this secondhand. They were not original hearers. They were not in the audience when Jesus spoke. But the occasion for writing is they were feeling this persecution. Let's go to the second slide, or the next slide there. And what we see is that there was an audience. And the audience, of course, were these Jewish believers in Jesus in Judea and around the land of Israel. Dr. Fruchtenbaum makes a very good case for why this is the fact of the matter. If you read enough scholars, your head will spin, because all these guys with PhDs, sometimes they just simply contradict themselves. And why that happens is sometimes they are employed by a denomination which had previously taken a stand that they on this doctrine or that doctrine. And so then the scholar almost feels indebted that he has to go ahead and cherry pick his facts in order to prove the assertions of his denomination. Fortunately, in some of our better Bible commentaries, we no longer have that obligation. We simply can go where the text leads us. And so the text leads us to the understanding that these were Jewish believers in Jesus. Why do we say that? And why were they around the land of Israel? It's because of the central plea that the writer makes to them. He adjures them, he begs them, he pleads with them not to go back into temple or rabbinical Judaism. That is the core thrust of the book. The core thrust of the book is Messiah, Jesus, is better than the Jewish systems of that day. We're going to get to that in just a moment so that you don't think it sounds anti-Semitic. Messiah, Jesus, is better is the overarching theme of the entire book. And that theme would make no sense if this was written to a general audience, because the general audience of Christians would never have been tempted to go back into temple Judaism because they were never in temple Judaism. Whereas around the land of Judea, where they're just maybe a day's walk from Jerusalem, going back to temple Judaism, trying to keep one foot in faith in Messiah while keeping another foot in mainstream Judaism, was something being considered by these individuals who received this book. They thought they could escape persecution if they simply kind of faded into the background for a little while and did not keep their faith on the front burner. They thought they could just step back into mainstream Judaism until the persecution kind of went away, and then they could step back into being believers. If you understand the date of the writing, you understand why that's such a dangerous decision on their part. 65 AD, the time of the writing of the book, is just 2 years before the revolt against Rome would begin. And once the revolt against the Roman occupation of Judea begins, war is on, and people are choosing sides. There were Jewish people who said they want no part of this, and they left Judea. They went to other Roman provinces, particularly across the Jordan, which were not in rebellion to Rome. Whereas other people were saying to themselves, and this is what they said to themselves, the temple, the temple, the temple. God will never allow the temple to be taken by pagans. So we're going to flood into Jerusalem, where God will ensure our safety. Prophetically, the writer of the book of Hebrews understands that that will be a life and death, particularly a death decision for them. Because what did Messiah Jesus say about the temple? If you remember, and we'll take time for questions at the end of this. I know I'm kind of I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, but we will have time for questions at the very end. So just want to put the alert there on Nigel and friends. Jesus himself, when he walked the earth, warned the apostles. Why? The apostles were admiring the temple. The temple was in the midst of being renovated. They looked up, they saw the beautiful polished limestone of the temple, and they were very impressed because it was undergoing renovation. Herod the Great, well, not Herod the Great, but the second Herod, his son, was throwing money at temple restoration in order to gain the favor of the Jewish people. He was trying to set himself up as a legitimate king by refurbishing the temple. And so the apostles were very impressed by this. What was Jesus' response to them? You see these stones? Not one will stay on top of another when the judgment comes. In other words, Jesus prophesied that a day was coming when Jerusalem would be judged for what we today, as theologians, call the unpardonable sin. Friends, there's a lot of confusion about the unpardonable sin. It boils down to one very simple definition. The unpardonable sin is attributing the miracles of Jesus to the power of Satan as Jesus walked the earth. It's a whole, it sounds complex, but it's actually a rather simple proof that Dr. Fruchtenbaum makes in a number of his manuscripts, which can be freely downloaded. There are probably 40 or 50 manuscripts that are downloaded for free. They're PDFs. They're extremely helpful. They're the equivalent of like 2 years at Bible Institute, just to read and understand those. So the unpardonable sin is seeing the miracles of Jesus as he does these and attributing them to Satan, which is exactly what many of the Jewish leaders in Jesus' day did. That generation, the generation that saw and rejected our Messiah, is the generation that committed the unpardonable sin, the only generation that did, the only generation that can. And Jesus said that the penalty for this is that, quote unquote, your house is being left to you desolate, and you will not see me again. Jesus said, you've sent me away. You say I do my miracles by the power of Beelzebub, and I will not appear again until you, the Jewish leadership, says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so in just a few years from the reception of this book, from the receiving of this book, Jerusalem is going to be under siege. Believers need to clearly take a stand for Messiah and not feel as though they can go back and forth from mainstream Judaism to believers in Messiah to mainstream, in order to escape persecution. Because the judgment on that generation that rejected Messiah, that judgment is coming. So the audience is Jewish believers in Messiah Jesus. Let's go to the next slide. In the next slide is the perplexing problem of the author of the book. And let me tell you by way of escape here, that far greater minds than I disagree on this issue. There seem to be evidence for Paul being the author. Some have put forward the name of Barnabas as the author. Some people put forward the name of Apollos as the author. All of these are educated, informed guesses, but none of them is airtight. Nowhere in the book does the author identify himself. Many of the style of writing is similar to Paul, but some of the emphasis seems to be somewhat different than Paul. And so scholars can energize their careers by writing books on these things. I have no interest in doing that, and so I will allow them to argue about it, and it really would not make a difference. The theology of the book of Hebrews does not contradict the theology of the rest of the New Testament. It's in keeping. Paul many times tells us that we are under grace and not under law. And that is one of the central themes of the book of Hebrews. And it is something that is very much in keeping with what Paul wrote. At the same time, from what the little we read about Barnabas and Apollos, it could very well be that these were authors as well. By the way, these names of Barnabas and Apollos, particularly of Apollos, this is a Gentile name. Barnabas is actually Hebrew. But the name Apollos lets us understand that many Jews in the ancient world, in fact, just about all of them, including Paul, had various names that were appropriate at various times. For instance, oftentimes you'll hear the poorly thought out remark, well, Paul's original name was Saul, But when he was converted, he changed it to Paul. I hear that a lot. It's 100% incorrect. And I say that with a smile on my face, with no malice. And I usually look for a gentle opportunity to inform people. Many Jewish people have Hebrew names that are used in the synagogue. For instance, my own name is Mordechai ben Shmuel. Mordechai is my first name, ben Shmuel. My father's name, his Hebrew name is Shmuel, Samuel Baleston. And so my Hebrew name is Mordechai ben Shmuel. The only time I'll ever hear that is in the synagogue if I am participating in the activities on the platform. And so for 17 years, we had a Messianic congregation. The congregation still exists. I'm no longer in the leadership there. But for many years, we had Torah services. And when I was called up to read the Torah, or to chant the Torah blessings, the rabbi, our new rabbi, we appointed, and he's a Jewish believer in Jesus, he would call me up he would say, Harishon, Mordechai ben Shmuel, Harishon, and he would call me up to read the Torah. So that's my name in Hebrew. However, my name in common language is Mottel. And so oftentimes people will have three names: a Hebrew name, a name used colloquially in the Jewish community, and then sometimes even a name used in the Gentile world. For instance, if your name is Mottel in Yiddish, which is what my name is, you might use the name Mark in the English world. So Paul was always Saul, and he was always Paul. He didn't change it because he never converted away from being Jewish. He was always Jewish. He converted from being a low-down, rotten sinner to being saved by the blood of the Lamb. That was his conversion. He was a converted sinner. And so even the name Apollos is simply the Greek street name for an individual who was most likely Jewish. He shows himself to be very learned in the Old Testament scriptures. And so I wish I could help you out on the issue of who is the author. But if you want to spend some time, if you've got lots of extra time, you can read Dr. Furtenbaum's midrash on that as he goes about, or on any good commentary. So let's go to the next slide. And here are some background concepts to keep in mind. And we'll probably take a total of about an hour and 15 minutes. We'll go to 15 minutes after the hour, and then take some time for questions. And hopefully that will work out well for us. Here are some background concepts to keep in mind. New Testament faith in Messiah Yeshua is not built on the foundation of what many today call Judaism. That sounds like a contradiction to what I said earlier, because we're talking about the importance of the Jewish roots of the faith, and that's true. But the word Jewish covers a lot of territory, it covers a lot of geography, and it covers a lot of time. Judaism has not remained static. It has been, particularly in the last 2,000 years, a faith that has dramatically evolved and changed from that which God originally intended. So that deserves a little bit of an explanation. In the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, particularly in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, God calls his covenant nation, the nation of Israel, people who are physically and ethnically descended from one of the 12 tribes, he calls them into a faithful covenant relationship. The constitution of this nation of Israel, the agreement between God and Israel, is Mosaic law. Mosaic law is the 613 commandments that are found in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That is the Torah, the Mosaic law, strictly speaking. Now, Torah is usually meant to be the 5 books of Moses, and I accept that. But Mosaic law is particularly the 613 rules and regulations found in those 4 books, the ones that Moses handed down. That is biblical Judaism. But biblical Judaism was meant for a covenant people the ethnic people of Israel. When mainstream Judaism started to come back to the land after the captivity, it started to morph and change. In Babylon, during the Babylonian captivity, well, I won't get too deep into the history here. During the Babylonian captivity, they were no longer had a temple. Remember, the temple had been destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. And so, with no temple, and yet your faith is built upon having a temple in Jerusalem, what do you do in order to carry out your faith of being a temple-centered religion when the temple had been destroyed? Well, in essence, Judaism had to become portable. That's a very important concept. Judaism became portable during the Babylonian captivity. It became a faith that could be carried out whether there was a temple or not, and wherever you were in the world. The way that this occurred is by making prayer and Torah study substitutes for the temple sacrifices. Temple sacrifices were the centerpiece of Old Testament Old Testament Mosaic Judaism. But without a temple, you're there in captivity in Babylon. You work 6 days a week, you got 1 day off. What do you do on that 1 day? Well, there was a brand new institution that developed among the Jewish people called the rabbis. No such thing as rabbis before the Babylonian captivity. But in Babylon, you now have to make sure that the religion survives, that your second and third generation children don't simply say, well, forget it. We'll never go back to Israel. I might as well learn about these Babylonian ways because, hey, we're here in Babylon. I don't think we're ever getting out. That would have been an easy mindset for some people to embrace. In order to combat that, the rabbis said, no, Judaism is eternal. It is the God of Israel. He is here even in Babylon, that God is not regional. That concept of God being regional is one of the keys to understanding the ancient world. Most civilizations, religious civilizations in the ancient world, had an understanding of God that was regional. You went to war to enlarge the territory of your God. The Assyrians went to war against the Egyptians to enlarge the territory of the Assyrian God, so forth and so on. It continued on that way. The Hebrew people, however, knew better. They understood that God is not regional. He is Lord over all the earth. You see that many times in the Psalms. He is Lord over all the earth. And so he could be worshiped in Babylon, even though they were in captivity, in servitude. And so they developed means to worship him. They developed rituals which would forgive sin. You gave charity, you did good works, you prayed, you did all these things as a substitute for the sacrifices of the temple. And so Judaism would start to develop these rituals almost by necessity. I am not saying that these were bad things. These were things that were done out of necessity by some very good, godly people who did not want their children to apostatize. Very understandable. However, when they got back to the land of Israel, those institutions, instead of being set to the side in favor of the temple, were picked up and they got bigger. The institution of the rabbis or the Bible teachers eventually became the institution we now know as the Pharisees. When the people returned back to the land, eventually the priesthood developed a political party, and that political party became known as the Sadducees. And these two were often at odds with one another, sometimes even at one another's throat. And so that brings us to the first century. You know, when the Old Testament closes, there in the book of Malachi, if you read your Bible that way, or Second Chronicles, which is actually the chronological way to read it, no matter how you read your Old Testament, at the end of the Old Testament, there's no Pharisees, there's no Sadducees, there are none of these institutions. Well, fast forward 400 years, the first page of the New Testament, All of a sudden, there are Pharisees, there are Sadducees. There's a whole global world of Jewish authority that did not exist. That world would ultimately become the world of rabbinic Judaism. By the term rabbinic Judaism, we say Judaism according to the rabbis. The rabbis were already formulating this version of Judaism. Here's an example. Oftentimes, Jesus would say to the rabbis, actually, he was talking to the crowd, but the rabbis were there, the Pharisees were there, and they were listening. And he was basically saying it to everyone. So Messiah would say, you have heard it said that such and such and such, but I say to you so and so and so. In other words, Jesus is saying, you have heard it said. In other words, the Pharisees are developing all of these extra biblical, post-biblical rules and regulations. It's known as the traditions. This is why Jesus said, you make of nothing the things of God because of your traditions. Increasingly, tradition was becoming more important to the mainstream Jewish community than the actual scripture itself. They would use the scripture as a jumping off place, but ultimately it was their evolving traditions that ruled the day. And Jesus pointed this out very, very correctly. You have heard it said that such and such and such, but I say to you, no. Let's go back to the Bible. And so the people pushing the oral tradition would eventually become known as the Pharisees. Ultimately, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the temple people, would join together in the Sanhedrin, and together they would condemn Jesus as being an apostate, and then they would hand him over to the Romans. Because, of course, the Jewish Sanhedrin, the Jewish courts had no ability for capital punishment. It was not the Jews who put Jesus to death. It was the Romans who decided on the death penalty, because they alone had the ability to carry it out. But certainly it came along with the statement of the Jewish authorities that this man is a rabble-rouser, he's causing trouble, and in our eyes, he is guilty. And so when people say that our New Testament faith is built on Judaism, that's a statement that is partially true, but it's incomplete. Which Judaism is it built on? Which Judaism are they talking about? Is it built upon the Judaism that God gave in the Torah, in the Mosaic Law? Or do they think that New Testament is built upon the Judaism that was later evolved by the rabbis in the oral tradition? Not to complicate things, but there's a big debate that goes on in the Messianic community about these very matters. A number of people like to try to keep a foot in both camps. They want to sit on the fence about this issue. My grandmother had a very colorful expression, and she said in Yiddish, if you sit on the fence too long, you just get a sore tuchus. And you can imagine what tuchus is Yiddish for. And this is what happens. When people want to appease everyone, they wind up speaking falsehood. No, the current religion of Judaism is a religion that evolved from those who had denied the messiahship of Yeshua. Now, certainly, its foundation is the Jewish Bible. Certainly, it is the same Jewish people. Ignore the conspiracy theories that say the Jews of today have nothing to do with the Jews of 2,000 years ago. That is nonsensical. It doesn't hold up to science or facts or history or anything. But what is today called Judaism is an amalgamation. It's some Old Testament rules and regulations, but a lot of it is also the later oral traditions that were developed by the rabbis to firm up their authority in things. And so we say here, and back to the PowerPoint, that New Testament faith in Messiah Yeshua is not built upon the foundation of what people today call Judaism, which is basically rabbinic Judaism, which was codified, just a little detail here, around the year 90 AD at something called the Council of Yavne. Yavne is a town in Israel. A bunch of rabbis convened there in the year 90 AD. Why 90 AD? It's 20 years since Jerusalem was destroyed. The rabbis finally pick themselves out of the dust. They say to the Romans, we won't give you any more trouble. Just allow us to assemble in Yavne, which is around 15 miles north of Jerusalem, and we're going to reformulate Judaism. Why did they need to reformulate Judaism? Because the temple was gone. Old Testament Judaism is built upon the premise that you have a temple to make sacrifices. You have a priesthood. Well, in 70 AD, almost 99% of the priests were killed in the rebellion against Rome. They had no choice. They were stuck there in Jerusalem. And the temple was gone. So now you have to go forward with Judaism that has no temple and no priesthood. You're forced to make Judaism a completely portable religion, because the Romans showed no sign of giving up Jerusalem. They had their own pagan temple that they were planning. Eventually, they would construct it. So we say here, in contrast to this, and this is the purple print there, that New Testament faith in Messiah Yeshua is built upon the foundation of biblical Judaism, as given in the scriptures, which prophesied the coming of a savior for all people. And so this is a tricky thing. We don't want to say that, no, Christianity is not built upon the foundation of Judaism. It is, but you've got to identify which Judaism. This is one of the problems we have in our Messianic community today, a community of which I am still a part. I served as a Messianic rabbi for 17 years in a good-sized congregation here in the New York metro area. And increasingly what I saw was that people wanted to codify many of the traditions of rabbinical Judaism and force these upon the Messianic community. Listen, I'm all for tradition. I'm very traditionally Jewish in a cultural way. I really take a backseat to no one in that. I was raised in a very culturally Jewish way. I love the feeling. I love the culture of it. It is near and dear to my heart. It warms my kishkes, as we say in Yiddish. However, it is not one the same as salvation. We have to follow Mashiach. Mashiach, Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, is the ultimate path for any person who claims to be Jewish. And so our faith is built upon biblical Judaism. And this is one of the issues there in the book of Hebrews. They were being increasingly attracted, the people who were thinking of stepping away from the church, stepping away from faith in Jesus. They were being attracted by a Judaism that had increasingly gone off the rails. By going off the rails, we mean that it was increasingly non-biblical. Increasingly, it was beholden to tradition rather than the scriptures. And so that's another background concept to keep in mind. By the way, I neglected to mention it. This PowerPoint can be freely sent to anyone. Nigel will be happy. Just you need to email him or buzz him or ring him up, as they say down under. Just ring him and he can easily email this. There's going to be a new PowerPoint each week. I'm going to build on this. This is just week one PowerPoint. Each week we're going to add to this. Ultimately, it will be about 30 or 40 slides. So you might want to wait, or you might want to grab this as you go here. So that's a background concept to keep in mind. Let's go to the next slide. Nigel, if you would advance us there. And here is kind of an overview of the idea of the book of Hebrews. What are the main arguments? Because Hebrews is not written as a meandering book of platitudes. It's written to correct wrong doctrine. It's written to correct wrong thinking. It's written to put people on a course correction because they were tending to veer back into the Judaism of the day. Again, this was written to Jewish believers. And so the structure overall of the book is this, that Jesus the Messiah is a better messenger than angels. We'll get to the reason for each of these things just a bit. He's a better messenger than the angels. he is a better servant than Moses, chapters 3 and 4. That's the chapter breakdown. He's a better messenger than the angels. The very word angel is one of the forms of the Hebrew root word for messenger. He's a better messenger than the angels, chapters 1 and 2. He's a better servant than Moses, chapters 3 and 4. He's a better priest than the Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood of Levi. He's a better priest than them, chapters 5 through 7. The new covenant is a better covenant than the old one, than the Mosaic covenant. It's contrasting new covenant with Mosaic covenant in chapters 8 and 9. And then in chapter 10, we have a better sacrifice in the person of Messiah than the old animal sacrifices, which were done under Mosaic law. And then chapters 11 and 12, there is a stronger and better faith as we place that faith in Messiah Yeshua. Therefore, chapter 13, we practice faithful obedience to him in all of these areas of human endeavor and social endeavor, sideways and person to person, and then upward, our spiritual relation to God. So all of these things, all these foregoing things, chapters 1 through 12, need to affect how we behave. We don't simply read the scripture and become smarter sinners. It needs to affect what we do. It needs to affect who we are and the way we go through the world. So just a quick reasoning for each one of these things. He's a better messenger than the angels. One of the things that was striking to me, my wife and I lived in Jerusalem about 30 years ago in order to do intermediate study of Hebrew. We had studied Hebrew here in America because our native language is English. We were taught Hebrew as children, but you're only taught enough to get you through a bar or bat mitzvah. So we wanted to learn Hebrew thoroughly. And one thing that we were shocked at when we moved to Jerusalem, we just were there for 3 months. We had an apartment for 3 months near where our school was. But we had a lot of time to go around the land, and we saw how much different Judaism was in the land of Israel, where they would light candles in the land of Israel. They would venerate the memory of deceased relatives and deceased famous rabbis. And part of that is this issue of angels. In modern day Western Judaism, there is no sort of appreciation for angels. They're just kind of set to the side. No one really considers them. Even in Orthodox Judaism, even there, it's not common. It's known, but in Reform liberal Judaism and progressive Judaism, as you have there in New Zealand and Australia, progressive Judaism, they would never consider this issue of angels. Yet 2,000 years ago, angels were a big deal. Angels were a major component in how Jewish people understood God worked in the world. God did things through the agency of angels. And as a result, the book of Hebrews starts off by talking about the fact that Messiah Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, is a better messenger than the angels. Moses was, of course, revered as the greatest of all of God's prophets. He was the lawgiver, and so he was literally the top figure in Judaism. And to go out on a limb and say that Messiah is better than Moses, you'd better have the facts to back that up. And the writer of the book of Hebrews certainly does that. Next, we come to the issue of the priesthood. When Hebrews was written, the priesthood in the temple in Jerusalem was still functioning. People didn't realize it was in its last days, but it was still functioning. And those who were tempted to go back into rabbinical Judaism, no doubt were enamored and impressed by the rituals and the pomp and the ceremony that went into a temple service. And those temple services went on every day. And some of the holidays, there was all day. And so it was a very impressive sort of ritual. very, very sacred, very solemn, and people thought that they could communicate with God that way. And yet, the book of Hebrews tells us that Messiah is a better priesthood. The priesthood, according to the order of Melchizedek, is what is held up as being greater than the priesthood according to the order of Aaron and Levi. It's a greater priesthood. We have a better covenant. Mosaic law was given to a single nation for a single time period. However, in the new covenant, it applies to all people, Jew and Gentile equally, all who have come to saving faith in Messiah. It is not limited by ethnic group. It is not limited by time. So we have a better covenant in the new covenant, which is first prophesied there in the book of Jeremiah, that there will be a new covenant coming. We have a better sacrifice because very clearly we're told that the blood of bulls, lambs, and goats cannot remove sin. It simply covered over sin. The most holy and solemn day in the Jewish religious year is a day called Yom Kippur. It's the day of atonement according to the Jewish calendar. But if you actually sit down with a rabbi and say, what does Kippur mean? He will tell you what it means to cover something over, to cover it over temporarily. Yom Kippur is a day of covering over sin. It's the most solemn holiday in the Jewish calendar, yet it only covers over sin. It doesn't remove sin. We need better blood that removes sin, and it's the blood of Messiah, Jesus, that does this. And of course, we have a better way because we have come to a way of pleasing God that is the original way, which is the faith that Abraham had. We recall the phrase, Abraham believed God, God counted it to him as righteousness. And so that would be the overview. And so what I am thinking now as the conclusion of this session is to invite Nigel